in our hymnals related to people who were victims of religious persecution, right? And speaking of that word victim, I discovered this week that it's a little more interesting than I had always imagined. It has a religious connotation to it. In the late 15th century, a victim was defined as a living creature killed and offered as a sacrifice to a deity or supernatural power. So a victim, in other words, was all about someone or some animal that had been sacrificed to God. That's what the word meant. I guess you could say the first victims were victims of God, at least in the minds of the people at that time. Now, playing the victim card was something we like to say. It's fairly common among human beings. It's a natural thing. And when I was looking into this past week, I found a following quote. Someone said to someone else, "You play the victim so well, I'm surprised you don't carry around your own body chalk." Think about that. That's terrible. Perhaps the phrase victim card is new to you, so let me explain that. Playing the victim card is like the same thing as victim playing, which is also known as playing the victim or self-victimization. This is the fabrication, in other words, something you make up about being a victim, and people do this for a variety of reasons. One is perhaps they become the victim so it justifies abusing other people, manipulating other people. Sometimes it's a coping strategy, and sometimes it's simply to seek attention. Where a person is known for regularly playing the victim card, that person may be referred to as a professional victim. And you know, I've been considering a new profession, right? But I decided no. Now, one reason religious folks have a tendency to play the victim card is because, well, people have often been persecuted for their religious beliefs, have become victims based on their religion. It's almost always a religious minority, however, that is persecuted and victimized, even today. You can Google religious persecution in the world and find hundreds of examples of this occurring all over the place today. For example, Christians are persecuted today in dozens of countries, but in all of those cases, Christians are persecuted in countries that are dominated by a religion other than Christianity, or in countries where there is no religion at all. And so I want to be clear about something as I talk about this today from the outset, and I'll come back later and discuss this. Christians are not being persecuted in America today. Not really. Now, individuals are sometimes persecuted for their religious affiliation, Christians included, and yet we have to admit that we enjoy about as much religious freedom today as anyone at any time in history. I mean, I don't know about your experience, but personally, I've never been persecuted or victimized for my religious beliefs or practices. Now, there was a time or two when I was younger that I was ridiculed for my religious beliefs and practices because I belonged to a really weird church in my hometown, and everybody knew it. And I know people laugh behind my back, but I was never persecuted, not really, and neither are you. Nevertheless, the myth that Christians are victims of persecution, particularly government persecution, continues to be a recurring theme in our country. And the following story I'm going to tell you sort of bears this out. This is kind of an account someone related and wrote about. He said, "A bright-eyed young man bounded into the waiting room of my doctor's office and proceeded to place some magazines in various locations. One of the magazines was a monthly called Persecution. When I saw it, I chuckled audibly, and he immediately launched into a monologue about the persecution of Christians in America. The dystopian picture he painted made it sound like we would be forced to worship in caves and sewers within a matter of months. Nothing I said could dissuade him from the conviction that he and his fellow believers were horribly oppressed, mistreated, and marked for imprisonment and death. I pointed out that if there was real persecution, this magazine would not exist, and he would not be freely distributing it. He finished our conversation by bizarrely admonishing me to trust God and offering to pray for me right there. I noted that the freedom to publicly pray for complete strangers should show him that he was not persecuted and actually enjoyed great religious freedom. This ended our conversation. End of the story. Why do we in America have a tendency to play the victim card in terms of religious persecution? Perhaps the religious players of the victim card in our country are merely trying to connect to Jesus and the first disciples from the first century. Our rather lengthy reading we heard from Linda from the Gospel of Matthew this morning is a passage that clearly suggests the first followers of Jesus were often victims of religious persecution. And if you know anything about the history of Christianity in the first few centuries, that continued to the extreme, right? But even so, for a few years at least, Jesus himself enjoyed the freedom to travel about the cities and the villages of his native country, teaching in the synagogues, proclaiming the good news of what he called the kingdom, and healing the sick. At first, it seems that the persecution was not directed toward him as much as it was just the general condition of the people of Israel. Matthew says that when Jesus saw the crowds, he had compassion on them or for them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd. And I suspect the word harassed here refers to the way they were being treated by the Roman Empire. In other words, his followers were, to some extent, even in that day, victims of an oppressive regime. Although they were allowed, to a large degree, religious freedom. And it was in this relatively free time that Jesus called a core group of followers together, known as the 12. And by the way, Linda, when you were reading the list of those names of the disciples, did you say Simon the Canadian? I misunderstood you. I was sitting here going, did she say Canadian? No, I know you didn't. You read better than that, I know. So he calls the 12 together, whether they were Canadians or not, and he sent them out to perform exorcisms and healings. Now, Jesus knew this was pushing the envelope just a little bit. He was going to be testing, the waters in terms of the Roman Empire's tolerance. Because whereas he, just being one person, he could go out and he could minister to the common folks without much harassment. Sending out a dozen of his followers to do the same, he knew would attract more attention from the powers that be. And it would be a threat to the powers that be. And so when he does this, he gives them some interesting safety tips. Several of them. First, he says, stay in your territory. Quote, go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Now, some people read that and they say, well, Jesus must have been very exclusive or even bigoted in saying this. But no, I think Jesus was merely being safety conscious. He knew what his people could get away with and where it would be safer for them to go. So first, stay in your area, right? Second, he tells them don't take anything of value with you. Quote, take no gold, silver, or copper in your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics, just one, or sandals, or a staff. Why does he say this? Because he knew that if they took anything like that, they might get robbed. Did you know today, homeless people are very reluctant to accept anything that looks new or expensive from generous people? For that very reason, they are afraid that the more criminal element on the streets will rob them. And so what do on purpose? They're poor, of course, being homeless, but they make sure they look poor and they don't have anything of value on them. That's for their own safety. And so Jesus is telling his disciples, look poor. Don't stand out like you're walking around with a lot of money, right? Look poor and you'll be safer. Third, for the sake of safety, he tells the 12 not to linger very long in inhospitable places. He says, if anyone will not welcome you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet as you leave that house or town. Sounds like simple advice, but I think Jesus is being a little funny right here. I do. The disciples probably laughed when Jesus lifted up a leg to shake off the dust from his sandal. I think that's a rather humorous image, especially coming from the Messiah, who's lifting his leg up and shaking dust off his sandal. Now, to further reveal the seriousness of their situation and the possibility that the 12 could fall victim to religious persecution, Jesus says, I am sending you out like sheep into the midst of wolves. What do you do about that? His advice to them is rather coy, but I think it's worth repeating. He said, so be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Now, what does he mean by that? Well, commentators have struggled to understand exactly what he meant by that, but I think he meant something like be smart, be safe. Don't draw unnecessary attention to yourself, because if you do, he goes on to explain, you will be arrested and tortured perhaps. And then he notes a few comments later that because of me, he says, there will actually be family discord and possibly violence. So he knew what potential trouble they could be in if they went out and they were too conspicuous about what they were doing. And then finally, he gives the ultimate piece of advice, safety tip. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. I love that. If they discover who you are in this town and they give you a hard time, then just go to the next town. So here's the truth of the matter. When you think about it, we are never persecuted on a scale anywhere near what they had to endure, not only in the first century, but in the first few centuries. Many Americans, I think, do have various reasons for playing the victim card, because there are forms of persecution in our midst, but religious persecution, unless you belong to a really weird church, it's not one of the reasons. Those of us who are in the mainstream, so to speak, of American Christianity, we're not really being persecuted. Nevertheless, as I pointed out, the persecution narrative is alive and well in American Christianity. Get online, you can read all about it. And as one person said in response to that, while Christians in other nations endure privation, physical harm, and even death, American Christians are content to imagine that all manner of benign occurrences are persecution. They will conflate their modern first world inconveniences and difficulties with the suffering and death of actual martyrs. If we're doing that, we need to stop. Because the truth is, 75% of Americans identify freely and openly as Christians. America is home to at least 350,000 churches and religious congregations, and only 12,000 of those are not Christian. This is not religious persecution. This is religious proliferation. We even tell ourselves that we are one nation under God. And our money claims, in God we trust. So compared to many in the world who are actually persecuted, we've got it good. And don't for a minute think that no one is watching how we're acting and what we're saying. In other parts of the world, Christians are being harassed, arrested, and sentenced to prison or even death. People are being beheaded and massacred. In many places around the world today, the victim card doesn't need to be played because the victimhood is so obvious. So when others around the world hear us complain about being persecuted because a store owner doesn't want his employees to say Merry Christmas, or an evangelical cake baker is sued for not selling a couple or selling to a couple whose marriage they don't approve, why would anyone believe anything we have to say? I mean, if we're whining about such minor trivialities, how can we be trusted for our moral guidance? If we make claims that are exaggerated, oh, we're being persecuted, why would anyone want to follow the one that we claim to follow, the one who sent out his followers with safety tips that were actually necessary for that time and place? The point is, we don't really need safety tips, do we? So here's my final take on this, using a little alliteration. As we continue to be Christian in a Christian majority country, let's don't play the victim card because that's disingenuous. And let's don't play the victory card either because that's arrogant and it's unseemly. Instead, here's a card we can play. Let's play the verve card. The verve card. That means regardless of what's going on, let everyone see your spirit and your enthusiasm. Amen.